Good morning, Evan Minard here, doing our book club. This is the third agreement from the 4 agreements by Don Miguel. And this one is Do Not Make Assumptions. Today is March 28th, 2023, and I have here with me
Tristan Pack. I'm back. I'm back in the book club.
Back in the book club with a little hiatus last week, and I didn't take it personally because that was last week's agreement. So as we go to today, it's Do Not Make Assumptions. It was a really short chapter, but really profound insight.
The whole book's really short, but super profound.
Yeah.
It's like you can read this thing in one day.
Yeah,
If you
absolutely.
wanted to. You probably shouldn't, because that way you can digest everything. It's pretty like deep when
Yeah.
it comes to like the philosophical aspects of it.
But how often do we make assumptions?
Dude, pretty much my entire waking day is meant making assumptions, I feel like. And they can be assumptions about anything. You can be like, oh, I'm going to get to work at this time. And then, oh, there's traffic. And it could be like, oh, I'm going to be able to do this. I'm going to have this be my electric bill this month so I can spend this much money. And then it's like, you just assume so many different things. I think it's just assuming is so natural because it gives you a sense of security. You know, like you think you know what's going to happen. Like you think you know the outcome of things, even though you never do. It's just kind of like a coping mechanism, like for lack of control, I feel like.
It's totally a lack of control and trying to have some semblance of knowing what's going on, and the uncertainty is really why people do it. I mean, I took this from me. The assumptions in relationships was huge.
Yeah, for
you
sure.
know, and so we have all these assumptions, and we can assume even with ourselves, or worst case scenario assumptions. We can talk about that later of like, what the worst case scenario is going to happen, and all these assumptions about what would have to take place in order for that to happen.
Yep.
But the big thing for me was like the relationships, and like the assuming with my wife, or assuming with my parents or my sister, or family members, or just without getting clarification. And I really liked in this chapter where it talked about, it's like fear. Because if I see fear and I recognize it, then I can step through it.
Yep.
But like just on autopilot, you're like, oh, why am I not talking about this tough subject? Or why am I not bringing up this situation? And without identifying it as fear, you just don't do it.
Yep. Yeah, I've definitely had my fair share of assumptions in relationships, both from the other person's point of view and a lot from my point of view too. I feel like I always assume the worst. I feel like what I've noticed is I always assume the worst in the things I care about the most, and the things I care about the least, I always assume the best.
Wow.
So I've noticed like if it's something really small, I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that. And it's like I just assumed that I could do it, or I assumed that I could do it that day, and it's like, man, I probably couldn't do it. But like when it's something I really care about, I feel like I always assume the worst thing, because maybe it's because you hold it more dear to your heart that you almost want to get the suffering out of the way now, that way it doesn't happen in the future.
Yeah.
I was listening to Jordan Peterson. I was driving my girlfriend back to Johnson City last night, and on the way back I was listening to Jordan Peterson, and he was saying how like in relationships you should never, this is like a common thing that I've heard a lot, but it's like if you really loved me you would know what I want right now, like that type of thing. And I've had girlfriends in the past who had said that, and it's like he said that's the stupidest thing you could ever say, because if the other person's not a mind reader, and also if you can't even know what you want and you can't say it, then how is the other person who's not you supposed to be able to know what it is?
Yeah.
Right? And you can take that everywhere. Everyone makes assumptions about everything. So I feel like these are like mentally, I feel like it's the thing that happens the most. To some like pretty much all day you're assuming something.
That exactly what you just said is what I deal with my wife, and we all kind of deal with in our relationships in various forms. But like the assumption that you're going to get credit for things you do, or they're going to realize what you need or want. Or be on the same page with something. If you haven't communicated it, they are in their own world.
Yep.
They're doing their own stuff, and it's kind of a hard pill to swallow. Being like, hey, I gotta like actually get clear about this.
Yeah, he was even saying that. He was like, you have to communicate and not make assumptions, but the communication part of it's so tedious and like difficult. It's easier to say like, you should know what I want, versus telling a person, hey, when like his example is like, if my wife wears this dress, I want her to tell me exactly what she wants me to say verbatim. That way I know what she wants out of it versus just saying, you know what you should do right now.
Yeah.
You know, because he doesn't know what he should do until he knows what he should do.
Yeah.
And like that little communication part of it is just so tedious, and it almost feels like you shouldn't even need to do it because you're like, oh, I love this person. I really shouldn't need to have this communication.
Yeah.
Because we're connected, you know, we love each other. So, but you need that communication. Like I feel like communication is the key to pretty much everything.
Yeah, and it changes from day to day, from moment to moment. Where like you just said, my wife will express something that was hard in her day, and I'm a solution oriented person.
Dude, same.
So I will just recognize that, hey, I'm gonna spurt out a couple solutions to those issues,
Yep.
or maybe she does want solutions or she doesn't want them.
Yeah.
Oftentimes she doesn't. She
Yep.
just wants to be heard and understood and listened to.
And the solutions can also make it a worse situation.
Oh,
You know?
it always does. But the thing is that if I'm really clear about it and say, hey, so what are you like looking for right now?
Yeah, that's a game changer. That's something I started doing too.
And it's almost like you're afraid to do that because there's like an intimidation of like, well, am I being not caring and loving by not giving her what she needs? But actually, it's really way better that way because you're like, well, what does she want from this? Because I'm willing to listen to you if that's what you want, and I'll just try to like be here with you in it versus like trying to come up with a solution. And then even just saying that as an option, the solution always comes up eventually.
Yep, always, every time.
But it's like they just don't want that at first.
Yeah, that's hard. I feel like every man's a solution-oriented
Yeah.
guy. And, you know, women, I feel like they are more of emotional support. And it's like that's two sides of the same coin, but both people struggle so hard in the other one that, like, it's hard to, like, manage the intermediary between the two.
Yeah. So I'll just go over a couple of these little underlines I had, which I thought were kind of cool. But all the sadness and drama you have lived in your life was rooted in making assumptions and taking things personally. So we have an assumption, they're going to meet that assumption or not, and then we think it's a personal attack on us because they didn't meet up to that expectation.
Yeah,
That they had no idea that they were supposed to live up to.
Yeah, it's really similar to what I think it was Epicurus. He said that like we suffer more in imagination than in reality. You know, I think I don't want to say it was Nietzsche. It probably was Nietzsche. He said that his hardest battles have been ones he's never fought, which was which is a good quote.
Yeah.
And like I feel like when you make an assumption, like I used to have a boss who like very hot and cold. You didn't know what you were going to get that day, and if I was even like a minute late to work, some days I'd get real chewed out, other days I wouldn't. And so like I would start to like on my drive to work, I would start to assume like, okay, what am I going to get yelled at for today? What's going to happen? Am I going to get this guy? Am I going to get this guy? Like, is it going to be hot or is it going to be cold? And like the whole time going up there, like my heart's racing. Like you're getting that stress response. And then by the time I would get to work, and then maybe he would be like, dude, you come to work earlier, or he'd just be like, hey, what's up, man? And like, but the emotional drainage that takes on you, like that assuming, is just so much. Like you just get so exhausted from it.
Yeah.
Just you're worrying about it so much.
Yeah, I had a similar experience with another person on a different shift.
Yep.
There was always this overlap when we were on and off shifts. You'd kind of do your handoffs, and it was like you never knew what you were going to get. And that's like the most exhausting.
That's the worst.
It's like I don't mind if you're an asshole,
Just be an asshole
but
all the
always
time.
be an asshole.
Yeah.
Then I know what to expect, and I show up with like, ready to deal with that. Like I'll put on my armor and I'll be ready for that. But if you're going to be my best friend, and then the next time I see you, you're a total lunatic. It's like that's really, and then back and forth. It's really challenging.
Yeah, and you're making assumptions the whole time, like, oh, I'll be fine, and it's not fine, and then like there's workplace drama that goes into that, and it's just like,
yeah.
I mean, that's just a whole.
But then it takes a lot of courage, right? To be like, hey, so what is it that you need from me?
Yeah.
To like have this be a good conversation. You know,
it's hard to do that with another adult. You know?
is.
Especially another guy. I feel like with a guy it's real hard because like, guys are really thick-headed and they're really disagreeable. So it's like you're almost walking into a war zone saying that. Like with I feel like with women, like they're more understanding and they'll communicate. But with men, it's like if he wanted to, he could just punch you right in the face. If just for asking that, you would know. Yeah. How do you deal with that? We use jujitsu, obviously, but But yeah, making assumptions, I feel like, is something that everybody does, and I feel like, I think somewhere in this, I listened to the audiobook, but I think somewhere in this he said it's better to make good assumptions than bad assumptions. Is that correct? Did he say that in the book?
I think so.
Because I don't know, I feel like assumptions either way can lead to some form of negative outcome. Like I don't really see a scenario where an assumption could be good for you unless it comes true. Unless you're like, oh, this good thing's going to happen, and it actually does happen. You're like, oh, look, I kind of predicted that. But if you're like, oh, I have a good assumption about how this is going to happen, and then it doesn't happen, unless you're mentally prepared for it not to happen, I feel like it'd be a thing that would be hard to deal with,
Yeah, I like that. I feel like I have negative assumptions, but also a lot of positive ones. And I feel like, as I'm just kind of thinking as you say that, the positive assumptions are also really good too. I mean, I feel like they can be good.
You feel it because they're positive, right?
Because
positive has to be good.
And I think a lot of times you create that through the assumption, like, hey, I was assuming I was going to have a good conversation with you today. Like, I just assumed that. And so it helps create like this situation where we show up and we're both in a good mood and we're kind of like showing up in a certain energy versus assuming like, man, Tristan's going to, this is going to be a tough conversation. He's going to be mad or he's going to be upset.
That's true. Okay.
So but if you had a bad day, let's say,
you're better prepped to deal with that.
I would be like kind of off guard or not really prepared for that. So that could affect it. And then if I didn't ask clarifying questions and I just took it personally, like, man, Tristan must be mad at me. Like, or he must be like upset. Like, I wonder why, he showed up like that. Maybe he doesn't want to do this, or maybe.
So I see what you're saying. So you're saying like the energy you come at the situation with when it comes to the assumption can help you lead to better ways of dealing with it.
I feel personally, and I don't know if that's what says it in here. I don't remember reading that.
Well, because that makes sense if you're assuming the best. Like if I'm teaching a kids class and I'm assuming like this is gonna be the best class ever.
Yeah.
And then like all the kids aren't getting it. The kids aren't focused. Some kid headbutted another one on accident. Like I feel like I'm much better prepped to deal with that. Now that I'm thinking about what I said, I feel like I'm much better prepped to deal with it because I'm like assume this would be a good class and I can still make it a good class just in spite of all the things that are happening from the outside.
Yeah.
But if I go into it assuming it's gonna be a bad class, then that the same events could happen. I could be like, well, I knew it was going to be a bad class. I'm just going to scrap everything, or we'll spar all day. Like, that's it, So I can understand where you're coming from. Like, the energy you attack the situation with from the assumption.
Yeah, and I think they might be two different things. I'm not really sure. I'm kind of working this through as you're saying that. But, like, the assumption that things work out is like a practice. It's like through stoicism, like, hey, this is, or religion or spirituality or whatever. It's like, hey, I don't know if this is good or bad, but it'll work itself out. It always has and always does. So you look in hindsight, like you're here and it's showed up in ways that have worked out. So you assume it's going to work out. I think that's a good energy versus because I've gotten caught up in, and this kind of goes back to my job back in the day in California, was like, I was assuming that people weren't going to understand me about the vaccine thing, about like, taking my rights away or, assuming it's the worst case scenario, all this like doomsday stuff. And that's like not a good energy either at all versus really getting clear and asking questions. They talk about that in here is like asking questions is the way to get through assumptions because, you get clarity that way.
Those questions are hard. It hurts the soul to ask those kind of questions, especially in a situation where maybe it's someone you care about and that you both care about each other and the other one's upset and you have to be able to wade through it. It's really difficult. Really, really difficult. And assumptions are just easier because you're just thinking in your head. Yeah. It's way easier.
Yeah. But there's so much gold in working through that.
Oh, 100%. And
I feel like when you're courageous enough to do it, when I have like a really tough conversation with my wife and there's a misunderstanding or we're not agreeing on something, and then I'm assuming she's doing it for a particular reason, then I ask a lot of questions and we get really real about something, it brings us way tighter. And I feel like that's what we hope people would do with us, right? Yeah.
Do you have anything else underlined in there?
Yeah, I have this that says, also find your voice to ask for what you want. Everybody has the right to tell you no or yes, but you always have the right to ask. Likewise, everybody has the right to ask you, and you have the right to say yes or no. So if you're not getting something out of a relationship or out of a situation and you want to get clear about it and you ask for it, you shouldn't be afraid that it's being, you're asking for too much. Because that's what we do. We're like, hey, I don't want to create waves. I don't want to rock the boat. But then you're internally resentful because you're not getting what your needs aren't getting met, or you're not feeling like you're meeting the situation the right way. and you have the right to ask. And so they also have the right to say no. And then you get clear about that.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, because I'm usually conflict averse. I don't really want to have a ton of conflict.
Yeah.
That you're kind of going into a zone where you're going to create a little bit of conflict.
Yeah.
But through that conflict, actually, a huge resolution comes from it.
Yeah, and also I feel like that conflict all breeds way to like something good, you know. And even if it's not like if you have a huge falling out with somebody and then you cut ties with them completely, it's still a good outcome because maybe that person wasn't just meant to be in your life.
Yeah.
You know, like my dad last year when I was going through like a whole ordeal with my job, I was like, for like 3 months, I was like, I need to quit, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it because I knew it was gonna be a hard conversation. Like it's one thing just to like put your 2 weeks in, but it's another thing to look at, you know, your superiors in the face and be like, hey, I'm leaving. And then like whatever they say, like being able to have the courage to just say, no, I'm not staying. I'm not doing this, no matter what they say. You know, and I feel like he always told me, he's like, you have the conversations you need the most are the hardest ones to have. And he's like, he said it's a skill to get good at hard conversations.
Absolutely.
And like I'm glad that I learned that lesson early. You know, like I could still be at that job and be miserable right now.
Well, and that could be the best thing that ever happened to that person, of having someone, you know, create a situation where they need to reevaluate internally, like how I'm treating people.
Yeah, that's true.
And so, yeah, it takes a bunch of courage to do that.
Yeah, I feel like it's, especially like I feel like it comes from when you're a kid. You know, like you don't want to, like when you have an elder, you don't want to ask them questions. You don't want to ask something from them because it's not saying it's disrespectful, but it's just like not the way things are. You know, like, and I feel like as you grow up, you still have that mentality. And you're like, I can't deny people. I can't do this. I can't do that. And like you're almost assuming that, but like you and me were both adults on the same level. Like you're older than me, but we're both adults on paper. So it's like we should both be able to have that conversation. You know, and I feel like that's why with my students, I always implore them to like almost like not resist what I'm teaching, but like question it. Like, hey, how would this, like, I love it when I teach like a kids class or even an adult class and they're like, hey, would this even work? And then like I get to like almost have a discussion with them on that because it's like they're conflicting my views and I need to be able to defend it. And if I can't defend it, then obviously I need to work on something.
Yeah.
You know, so I feel like just communication is like one of the hardest. That's why I try to teach my students, like, you have to be able to communicate with people.
Yeah.
I feel like that's like, if it's not the number one, it's probably number two, number three on the list of like the most important life skills you could ever have.
Well, going back to, you know, being impeccable with your word and then not taking things personally. It's like all of this stuff works itself into each other. It's like if you're being honest and you're not going to take it personally if they say no to you, but you've expressed what your needs are, then it's like, okay, we're at a point of which maybe this isn't going to work. And like we've come to that agreement.
Yeah,
like,
there's no assumptions to be made either.
Yeah.
Because you're honest with yourself. You're honest with your word, what you're saying. You're not going to take what they say personally, so there's no assumption to be made.
Yeah.
You kind of already like have narrowed the pathway down to what could happen.
Totally.
You know what I mean? So I feel like that's a really good chapter.
This one, the last one I had was information or an idea is merely that seed in your mind. What really makes a difference is action. Taking the action over and over again strengthens your will, nurtures the seed, and establishes a solid foundation for the new habit to grow. And they're just talking about how this is a hard thing to do. And we all as humans make assumptions because it's a shortcut way to get to feeling comfortable in uncomfortable situations. And through practice, when you ask clarifying questions and are humble enough and your ego isn't so big that you're going to not allow yourself to do it, you can grow.
Yeah, my dad also gave me some advice on this. He has a philosophy degree, so he's just like tuned into everything, you know. And I just grew up with that. I struggle with really bad anxiety, and you know he does too. But he's lived a lot longer than me, so he knows how to deal with it better. And he always said that like action is the cure to anxiety, you know. And you know, there's obviously you could find some caveats in that, obviously, but I feel like when you just kind of sit there and just you're making assumptions all day long, you're not doing anything about it. That's where like the suffering comes from.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. And there's a quote that I want to say it to my kids' students all the time, but I can't say it because I have a cuss word in it. But you've probably heard it, but it's like, you know what assuming does? It makes an ass out of you and me. And I think that's the greatest play on words ever because it spells assume and it makes an ass out of you and me.
Yeah.
And it's so true because it makes an ass out of that person for assuming something, and it just definitely makes an ass out of you for like just even you went through all that suffering for nothing, you know.
Yeah.
And like all the way up, like you're saying, to hard conversations, there's going to be assumptions being made, but you have to like Like I like the way you're thinking. Like the energy you come at that assumption with is really important because you can handle it, the actual event when it happens. Because if you're just worrying the entire time, like I still have this problem. Like where if I'm about to have a hard conversation, I'm assuming the worst things leading up to it, and I don't even know what I'm going to say in the conversation. And then, like, the conversation comes about, and I've been thinking the worst of what they're going to say, but I've not thought once about what I'm going to say. And then that just is, like, just awful because I'm, like, stuttering. I don't really know how to convey my point very well. I'm very obviously nervous, and it just makes the whole situation worse. Whereas if you're like, okay, maybe they have a negative reaction to it, but here's how I'm going to handle it.
Yeah.
You know, maybe the best comes out of this, and we hug like bros afterwards, and we're fine. You know, but if you're thinking like, dude, they're probably gonna hate me forever, they're gonna never want to talk to me again. You're thinking that while you're having the conversation with the person.
Yeah.
And it's gonna make it harder for you to say what you want. You know what I mean? So I like the way you're talking. Like the energy you come at something with is really, really important.
Yeah. It's funny as you were saying that I was thinking about times where you think. You're assuming things are going to be hard, or you think this conversation is going to be a really tough one. Particularly, like I'm thinking about like when you have to give constructive criticism, you know, and or discipline to someone.
Yep.
And then you have this whole story built up, and then you go and deliver it, and they're like, "Oh, okay, thanks. I didn't even think about that." It's like just this total like matter of fact.
Yeah.
They receive it in like such an easy, honest, like receptive way, and you're like, "Holy shit! I just like." Way blew this out in my head.
Yep.
And it was just like this really, really minor thing.
And all that energy you could have been using towards something productive.
Totally.
Yeah. But it's hard to control assumption because you're in your head all day long.
Yeah.
You know. So how do you think you make assumptions? Like what's something that you assume the most about? Like would you say that they're pretty good assumptions, or would you say like you were saying with your relationships, like it's harder to have good assumptions about things. But is there anything else like maybe with your kids or with your work? Or even with jiu-jitsu that you assume that something's going to be a way? Is it good or bad? Like, what are your assumptions usually look like?
I think with my wife, I assume that she realizes when I'm not feeling loved enough, you know, and that's whether or not that's through physical or through connecting one-on-one conversations or like, you know, our daily lives start going a certain way.
Yep.
And we just keep going down that path and we haven't really connected in a deep, meaningful way in a day or two or three. And I'm like, assuming she should know that that's how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And instead of being like, hey, babe, like I would really love to connect with you. Like, let's have a conversation after the kids go to bed and like, let's just really catch up in a deep, meaningful way. So I feel like we're on the same page and like, this is going to help me feel better and in tune with our relationship.
Yeah.
Instead of that, I'm like, she should know that I want that or need
Exactly. Yep.
that. And that's just not the case.
Yep.
You know, because she has her own story and
reader.
her own things going on. And I think that's an interesting place to be, you know?
It's like a limbo state.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, I feel like I always assume the best about like the outside world and then the worst about like me and my effect on the world. You know what I mean? Like I feel like if I'm making a life path, I'm like, oh, in 5 years I'm gonna do this, and then I'll assume like, well, can I do that in 5 years? Like, can I really do that? Or it's like, well, maybe this goes wrong and I have to change and pivot. And it's like I'm thinking about something when I'm like 27 and I'm 22 right now. I'm thinking I'm getting stressed out and assuming something of 5 years down. Like 5 years ago, I was still in high school.
Yeah.
You know, like that's like I didn't know I was going to be right here right now. I didn't know I was going to be doing jiu-jitsu full time. I didn't know that, you know, all the stuff that would happen in my life would happen. So you can't even like think that far ahead. Like you can't even really think 2 hours ahead because you don't know if you're gonna have a conversation with someone. You might get in a car crash on the way there. You might have a huge traffic jam where you could like almost happen here. I had a huge traffic jam. I thought I had time to get here, and I barely made it through. But like you can't really make assumptions about anything. So I feel like it's just I feel like it's a pseudo power you have over the world. You know, it's like you're trying to like control everything. And
Yeah.
The only way you can control it's in your head. And this thing definitely just runs rampant, and you can't really control it because it just gets out of hand.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm still trying to noodle on that whole concept of the positive assumptions, and it's almost like a framework of looking at the world. Like you're either optimistic or pessimistic, kind of in a certain way, and you either think that things are going to continually go in a good way or continually go in a bad way. And so those assumptions, the way you're looking at the world will feed those assumptions. And that I think that has a positive impact because you're looking, if you're assuming things are going to go well, you oftentimes will look, what you look for, you find. And so that's like a good cycle. A
Yeah.
negative cycle would be when you're assuming things are going to go poorly.
Yeah, you see everything bad.
Yeah, so you can kind of create that as well. But I think for me, the take home again, it goes back to like just the relationship and really getting with different people and interactions with people and just being honest about where you're at, having tough conversations, asking tough questions, and getting really clear. I think that's kind of my take home.
Yeah, I feel like, especially as a parent, I feel like you have to assume the best out of the world, you know, because you brought a kid into the world. You have to assume the world you brought your kid in is going to be a good one. Because if you don't assume that, then you're kind of like not an evil person, but like what kind of life is that kid going to have? You're just going to be real depressed all the time. So I feel like as a parent, it's easier to have like not easier, but you want to be more aligned with the positive side because like your kid's life like depends on it and like their future depends on it. But I feel like, you know, if you're younger, like you're assuming the worst out of the world because you don't really have anything good to assume about. You know, it's just you know, like you have less view of yourself than you would of your kid, which is really weird to think.
Yeah.
But me and my dad were talking about that one time because his girlfriend told me that like he never told me this obviously because he's my dad and he's a real stoic guy, but she told me that he told her that his whole like philosophical shift happened when I was born. Because it's like you have to have hope in the world in order to have a kid. Because if you don't have hope in the world, you're not going to want to have a kid. Yeah. And it's like, because everyone my age is like, do I really want to bring a kid into this world? Like it's, you know, China, you know, the recession. But like everyone, dude, imagine like you're in World War II. World War II is going on right now and you're having a kid. Like that, you have to have hope that things are going to work out. And I feel like that leads to a more positive assumption. It's like having something that like you believe in. And like you have to have a positive viewpoint, or else that thing's gonna like crumble, you know. Yeah. And you know, I feel like that could apply to your life. That could apply to your kids when you have them. If you already do have
faith,
them,
you know,
faith
people's
too,
faith. I
religious
mean, that's
faith.
religious faith, and it helps people have at least things are tough right now, but I still have a faith and a hope that there is another path.
Yeah, truly religious people, I feel like, are like the strongest mentally people. Like I was joking with my girlfriend. I was like, if I'm competing and I see a white dude across from me, I'm fine. If I see a Brazilian across from me who prays before he gets on the mat, I know it's going to be like one of the hardest matches of my life because like they're going to fight so hard. Like think about Khabib, like he's one of the greatest fighters ever. He's probably the most religious fighter ever, and like they have such a strong will to like enact things, but they also have such a positive viewpoint on if those things don't happen. Yeah, you know, and like I feel like that, like you're saying, like spiritual people, like they're definitely like. They can make a good. They have to have a positive assumption about things because that's like just what their faith tells them to do. Yeah, you know, I definitely feel like, and then, you know, I grew up atheist, so that's probably why like I feel like I have like a more negative viewpoint because I don't have that faith. I'm getting more into religion as I'm getting older for sure, and it's definitely helping a lot, you know. But I feel like you're saying, faith is really important for like positive assumptions. Yeah, because you know if I believe in God and I assume a bad thing's going to happen, what does that say about my faith in the world and like my creation and things like that, you know? So you have to assume the best out of things. Yeah. Just to be alive, I feel like. Yeah. You're not going to be having a good life if you're just assuming the worst all the time.
Yeah, it's those cycles, man. It's the up cycle, the down cycle. You get in these mental cycles, and the being around positive people is super helpful. Being in and sharing positive ideas and optimistic ways of looking at things is really empowering. But yeah, man, I appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, that's a good one. Short chapter. The next one I'm really interested in is the do your best, right?
Yeah, the last chapter is
the last.
Always do your best.
Yeah, that's like, I might buy the book just for that chapter because that's like my favorite saying. Always do your best.
And yeah, we'll get into it then, but it's an interesting concept because I think everyone's always doing their best, even when they don't realize they're doing their best. And that's, you know, we put these judgments on ourselves. We'll cut it here. In 2 weeks, we'll get back for the last chapters, and then we'll start another book. So if anyone's here still at this end of this recording, have a blessed day. Take care.
Have a good one.